This is the Philanthropy Show, connecting and inspiring philanthropy.
Welcome to the Philanthropy Show. I am your host, Luann Zaraga Walters. This is the first of a new phase for the Philanthropy Show. We're relaunching. Sharon and I had a heart-to-heart after the election, some of the conversations that we had, and the atmosphere that we have within our country right now, and that this show was meant to really be a voice for nonprofits, the work that you're doing, the work that you as staff, as board members, as donors do, how we can help you do that work at a grassroots level. And we want to expand that even more because there are so many issues that have really bubbled to the surface, and in a good way, I think, that we have this conversation, the dialogue prompted. So the Philanthropy Show is no longer about educating and empowering and uplifting nonprofit staff, board members, and donors. The Philanthropy Show now is simply that, for the love of humanity. Philanthropy, the definition, it's exactly what it means. And we are going to look at topics that will really get us engaged in dialogue. Starting off, we decided to launch this with a really kind of raw discussion that has been circulating. I've seen it on my Facebook, I've seen it on Twitter, I've had conversations with friends at lunch, because there's a lot of confusion. And so this spotlight on white privilege is designed to help us unlock what that looks like, to try to walk in other people's shoes, to understand our country as a whole and all the vast different experiences and filters that we've been raised through. I couldn't imagine doing this show without the organization who has agreed to, thank you so much, do this 3-part series with us today, which is Community Tampa Bay. I'm going to let our executive director tell you a little bit about Community Tampa Bay. My personal experience was that I worked there in development for a year. I met some extraordinary people, but even more importantly, I had an extraordinary personal shift in that I found out a lot of things about myself that I didn't know I held as deep personal beliefs. It helped me grow as a human being. It helped me relate to other people. And I'm very, very grateful that we have Jennifer Yeagley, who is the executive director. Thank you for coming on. We also have Sam Obeid and Sarah Ogdie. Sam being on the left of our screen, Sarah on the right. Sam is the Anytown coordinator. You'll hear a little bit about this amazing program also in the course of these 3 series. And also Sarah, who I love, known her for many years. Her hair is always changing and it's gorgeous today. I love it. And she's the program director. So we've got just a swath of talent with us today. So let's start off, Jen, with you. And first off, tell us a little bit about Community Tampa Bay, kind of the history, and what's your goal? What's your vision?
Well, thank you so much for having us, Luann. You hit the nail right on the head in capturing the conversations that are happening right now, and people are really hungry to talk about this topic and broader topics about social identity. And so we're so grateful to have the chance to have this conversation with you and your viewers. Community Tampa Bay has actually been around in this community for many decades. We were known for some time under a different name we started out as the National Conference for Christians and Jews organization, and then in the early 90s became known as the National Conference for Community Justice, broadened our mission and vision to include a broader swath of social justice issues, including racial justice, gender justice, to expand on that interfaith conversation. And then when the national organization went away in 2005, we rebranded as Community Tampa Bay and kept doing the important work that we've been engaged in for many decades here locally. We are probably best known for our youth development program, Anytown, which engages teens ages 14 to 18 in our ambitious vision, which is to end all forms of discrimination. And the way that we do that, whether we're working with youth or adults, is to teach people how to have hard conversations with people who don't look like them or who come from different backgrounds. And we call those tactics dialogue and cross-cultural interactions. And these are actually proven prejudice reduction strategies that have been studied for many, many years and are shown to work. And I've been seeing a lot on my social media feeds and in the news in these past weeks about this notion of dialogue and its importance in, bringing people together and how it can really help heal divides. And also a lot of talk about cross-cultural interaction. And again, what that is just bringing people together who are different, who have different backgrounds, different social identities, to engage in meaningful conversations, to become friends, to get to know one another, and to really, talk about things that maybe are uncomfortable and hard to put out there. But if we can walk through that together and experience that discomfort together and safely, we come out of that changed, having our hearts and minds changed. And Community Tampa Bay is so honored to have been doing that work for, like I said, many decades. And we feel like in this moment, important than ever that we push forward and expand on the work that we've been doing and bring more people into the conversation. So thank you again for having us, because we feel like this is one step in that direction.
Absolutely, my pleasure. You said two key things that I really want to dig into as we're having this conversation about white privilege, and that is that you called it the prejudice reduction strategy, and I really love the feel of that, because it's not like a finger in your face. You need to act this way or behave this way. It's really about that. I don't know, that there's a whole amount of that I think we'll get into, and also the cross-cultural interaction. My niece is in San Francisco area, and at age 12 she went through her first challenge, and the activity that they used, which I know that Sarah and Sam, you're aware of this as well, was standing in the line, and you take a step forward if this happened, and you take a step backward if you did not have access to this, that, or the other. And it was an eye-opening experience for her. And I love the fact that we have this type of these types of strategies, these types of cross-cultural interactions that we can actually come together even at 12, to really get that sense. So let me start, in going back to Jen. I want to launch this off about our conversation with white privilege. And Jen, what do you see? Where are we in this national discussion? What has unveiled?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things that I've noticed, the day after the election and in the couple weeks, going on 3 weeks now that have since passed, one of the most interesting things has been in my conversations with other white people, where there has been such a register of shock and surprise at the outcome of the election. And I shared in that, initially, certainly. And as I started to think about that shock and surprise that I was feeling, and hearing that from other people that I was interacting with, and again, seeing things online nationally, I started to think about, why was I surprised? And, as I began to talk to some of my team members here at Community Tampa, my personal life, primarily people of color, people who are Muslim, who they actually shared with me, I'm not surprised at all. And so that added another layer to this notion of, my own white privilege, frankly, which is that I had this, the luxury of being surprised by the outcome of the election, because I am not a targeted group. And while I am a woman, and certainly, not to at all dismiss any of the misogyny, that came up on the national campaign trail, but certainly am not among the most targeted groups for hate and hate speech and sort of, people seeing real fear right now. And so I think that has been, one of the biggest things that has impacted me personally in these past weeks, but certainly a lot of what I've heard, in the discussion is this notion of shock and surprise. And then, sort of coupled with, so what do we now do? And this, again, is coming from individuals who, in my spheres of influence, consider themselves to be quite progressive. So we're sort of having some of the same conversations, but as I think about that and begin to unpack that a bit, it's that, are we truly as progressive as we need to be? And, maybe we haven't been, and what have we missed, and where are the gaps? And so again, I think the conversations that are starting to unfold are a great starting point for this next chapter, hacking this notion of white privilege and figuring out how to create some real change.
You've done it again. I didn't realize that, but I had that own sense. And so Sam and Sarah did this. I'd be interested to hear your takes as well. I can totally relate to what Jen just said, in that now I'm shocked at my surprise, and I'm seeing that in a different way. And as you said, that's another layer of white privilege. What was your experience around that? And let me go to Sam and Sarah.
Good. I echo some of the same surprises, and I think the challenge for me was not necessarily in the content of what was being said, because frankly, those are things that most of us are familiar with and have heard before. And I think that's something that was really highlighted, when we do workshops with young people and with adults on things like stereotypes and assumptions. A lot of the comments that were being made nationally are things that we hear every time we do that workshop. The idea that Muslims are terrorists, the idea that Mexicans are rapists. These are not necessarily new ideas that are being brought forth. It's a new stage that they are being shared on. And I think there's definitely significance to that. And so I think for me, the shock and surprise came more from the fact that so many people resonated with those messages, and that the messages themselves were almost like a finally someone is saying it kind of a thing, as opposed to, oh my gosh, someone's saying it. And so I think, my surprise was certainly with kind of how things were unfolding, but also in terms of that some of the comments and some of the behaviors that we were seeing that did racism and sexism and Islamophobia and misogyny, the support that they were getting. I think that was the piece that was unfortunately most surprising for me. And at the same time, said in terms of what we see in our programming.
Wow. How about you, Sam?
To be honest, I wasn't shocked by the outcome of the election at all. I'd been saying it ever since Ted Cruz dropped out of the race. I'd been saying there's quite literally a 50-50 chance that Trump will become president. When he got the candidacy, I was quite confident because I'm not a citizen of the United States. I'm also a queer person of color, and I'm Muslim, so a lot of what he was saying are things that I've heard personally before. So if one person can say it, so can 50,000 others. If one person can say it, so can a million others. I've been in the country for about 9 years now. I came here when I was an adult. And a lot of that experience, living here as an outsider, but still finding this place to be home, has shown me that it can always go either way. So I feel like I feel like myself and a lot of my communities were very strong in the idea that we need to fight this from the get-go, because just the possibility that somebody like that can become president in itself is removing of democracy as it should be. And
I want to just pull this together just a little bit, because I think where I'm seeing that, and I love hearing your stories, because you've got a completely different perspective that I couldn't even possibly relate to. And I want to say specifically about this show that we're going to walk that fine line, but I will do that as I can in not being political, but really talking about the white privilege factor. And what you've just shared, Sam, is important because you hear it every day, that you've personally heard these kinds of words. And I think my shock came in hearing it, not necessarily that somebody said it, but that people I know, people that I call friends and family, could actually say that too, that they had these beliefs that I didn't realize were held. And I think that that's a big part of where that personal reaction comes from, is that, you see these posts on Facebook where folks are saying, can you believe, how do you respond to your father? How do you respond to your, whatever? And it's very real. So why is this, Sarah, when we were having a conversation prior to this show, you made a comment that I can hold on to, and you said, we all know that racism is bad, but I think how we define it is drastically different. So why is it important? Let me come back to Jen. Why is it important for us to have these conversations that are open and raw like this?
Well, and I think you're right. When Sarah had shared, we can all agree racism is bad. I think that's true. I think for the vast majority of individuals, we always have extremes, but I think if you ask maybe the average person or the vast majority of folks, they would say, yeah, I don't believe in discrimination. I think racism is bad. But what's so important about these conversations is that we fail to define what racism really means. And often when people think of racism, they are thinking of the overt types of racism that include racial epithets and outright discrimination and violence against, people who are non-white. What often people are not thinking of, is implicit bias, our own biases and assumptions that we make because we've been socialized, in communities and in institutions that teach us time and time again, about white privilege or not about white privilege, but that reinforce racism time and time again without us even knowing it or even having to consider it, because we are white and can move through these institutions in a way where we don't have to think about that. And I think that that is actually a more nuanced, more difficult thing to understand. And, you know, can in some cases almost be more dangerous because we fail to talk about it and we do fail to unpack it. And we think that everything is okay. I don't say the N-word, you know, I don't call Muslims terrorists. I don't engage in this type of overt behavior. So I am not racist. When in reality, you know, as a white person moving through this world, I am often complicit, you know, every day in systems that uphold that uphold institutional racism and bias. And if I am not constantly challenging that and unpacking that and engaging with my own bias, then again, I'm complicit in this system. And, you know, so part of where these conversations have to happen, part of the goal is, and for us to be able to, you know, to say, because I am white, I benefit from these systems, and to kind of take the charge out of that, you know, because that is a reality. It doesn't make me a bad person. It just means that I benefit from privilege that I did not earn because I am white and that's how I was born.
And I'm glad that you said it doesn't make me a bad person, because I think in hearing this, that as the conversations are happening, there's two different camps. One camp is without approaching it from a stance of dialogue, and I'm just speaking to what I've seen. It is all white people are racists and you should, or you should not, without going into an educational opportunity or discussion of why. And that actually has put a lot of people on defensive and they don't want to hear anything. So we've limited their ability to actually engage in discussion because we've, you know, really thrown that finger point at them and said, you need to understand that because you're white, because you have this privilege, you need to act in a different way. The other camp, though, as you're discussing this, I'm hearing the being complicit and what that might look like. And it makes me think of conversations where people have tried to say, I don't believe in this. I believe that this is wrong for a number of reasons for my non-white friends. And yet then somebody else will come in and say, you're just, you know, throwing this out there. And this is one of the points of why I wanted to do this show. Not all Trump supporters can be lumped into this huge category of racial da-da-da-da-da. There definitely is some of that white privilege if they don't understand, or there's a whole bunch of nuances there, but we can't label everybody together in a bin, just like we can't label all of Clinton supporters into being crunchy granola liberals. I mean, that's, you know, we've ostracized ourselves because we've tried to really polarize this issue, and we can't polarize this issue. Sam and Sarah, have you, you know, how do you handle conversations around that when you're talking with teens in schools or with your adult friends? How do you handle these types of conversations of wanting to really polarize the situation?
I think it's a question of, especially when it comes to the youth, I think it's a question of meeting them where they are. Because they come to the table from a slightly, I want to say they get everything that's going on, but they slightly different perspective, right? Like they're having all of the experiences, but they're not necessarily knowing what to name it. They are experiencing the privilege. They're seeing that their counterparts of, you know, different racial identities, different religious identities, different sexualities, so on and so forth, might not experience those same privileges, but they don't necessarily know how to name it, right? But when especially speak to youth in schools, their questions are very direct. They're not politicized. They're just very direct in terms of the cultural experiences that they're having. And when you're able to put it in context for them within their own experiences, and then able to give them language within which they can name that, provides for a more productive conversation between them and me. So I'm not talking to them adult to youth.
Yeah.
Person to person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
so
I like that.
That I have found works really well, because youth they're very direct. They're very straightforward. They don't mince words with you. You know, they're not trying to beat around the bush. They're not trying to have a politically anything conversation. They just want to know. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes I feel like they don't get those direct answers. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes everything is political. There's no question about that. But the manner in which everything is politicized makes it difficult to get to the heart of the idea.
Yeah.
Right. So, but when you break it down to these are the stereotypes, it's not new. This is discrimination. It's not new. But the same manner in which those humans that you possibly are not in agreement with have the language with which to name it, this is the language with which we can potentially name it. And this is what that
And
looks
so,
like.
yeah, starting where you are.
Right. Absolutely. And I feel like our role is also to bridge. You know, like Jen said earlier, we get a lot of different people in the same rooms and try to have productive conversations. And so with that comes a high degree of discomfort that we are very comfortable with. And so I think setting the expectation that having to be easy, and I think sometimes as adults, we forget that. And so I think when we are doing our programming, we can kind of set the stage for this is a space where we are going to ask you to take some emotional risks. And we promise that you're going to be safe when you do that. And I think that all of our spaces could benefit from something similar. I think in bridging, it is also our role to explain that there is very justified and real anger on the part of people of color, on the part of Muslims, on the part of women, on the part of LGBT folks. There's a lot of anger and a lot of emotion about the fact that these systems have been in place for a long time. So like Sam said, none of it is new. And so I think part of us, you know, when you were talking about the two different camps, I think our role is saying there is validity in both of these camps. And so it's not to say that one is right and one is wrong, but how do we come together and how do we move forward, acknowledging and not forgetting the things that we might not understand or that might not be a part of our experience.
Wow.
And so I think about Beverly Daniel Tatum has a great analogy for white privilege that specifically references a moving sidewalk, like the ones that are in airports. And it says racism or sexism or homophobia are like these moving sidewalks where you're standing on it and you don't necessarily realize that you're standing on it, but you're moving in one direction, and that is one towards racism, and that is one towards sexism, because that is how, unfortunately, our society is set up. And unless we are willing to turn around and actively walk the other direction, anytime that we are doing nothing, we are still on that moving sidewalk. And so I think for people who have always been able to see that moving sidewalk or get a chance to see all the ways in which different communities have it easier, whether that's men versus women, whether that's straight folks versus queer folks, there are a lot of different ways in which some people can see the advantages very clearly, and others of us are just kind of standing on the sidewalk, not really seeing what's going on. And so I think our role is to bridge the emotions that are happening on both sides, both the confusion and the discomfort of saying, what do you mean I was on a sidewalk? I didn't even know I was on a sidewalk, to the anger of saying, what are you talking about? You've been moving faster for so long. How do you not see it? And so I feel like that's often in our programming, our role is to bring those communities together for productive dialogue.
I love that, and you've just now brought me to the point that we'll broach this subject, and then we'll wrap it up and go into the second show. But the first question then is, we've talked all around it, but Jen, help me define this. What is white privilege? When people say white privilege, what is that referring to?
Essentially what it refers to, and this is not a dictionary definition, right? This is just it is a definition of my own lived experience and kind of what I know just from being in this work for a while. But essentially, this is any kind of privilege, but speaking specifically about white privilege, it means that, again, systems have been institutionally set up for the couple hundred years that American society has been around, 250, 75 plus years. All of our systems were originally set up in the interest of white people because those were the people who were setting up those systems, right? And at that time, there was a lot of overt, horrific discrimination, whether it was slavery or women being treated as property or all of these different things that are in our history. While there have been laws and norms and civil rights and women's rights along the way, essentially, this has not yet been enough to completely dismantle the institutional privilege in our education system, in law enforcement, in all of the different ways that we are socialized, whether it is in our families, in our neighborhoods, and in our broader communities. All of these different layered things create systems that reinforce this notion of on skin color, based on gender, based on, again, things that were originally set up when we were founded. And so what that looks like, you know, is everything as simple as, something as simple as I don't have to think about the fact that I am racially white, that is my race, because that is the accepted dominant race in our society. So the notion of me having a racial identity, while that is a fact and I am a white person, it's not something I have to think about on a day-to-day basis, because I can walk into a store and walk through that store and have my whole life done so and have never worried about being followed around or never thought twice about that. And when I talk to, you know, friends and colleagues who are people of color, that's an experience that happens to them daily. And so it's something that simple, you know, on up to more complex things like, you know, being accepted into graduate programs, or being, you know, maybe having a clear path, you know, to college or to a graduate program, or through my education, or having a traditionally white sounding, you know, European name, so that when I put that on a resume, nobody is thinking twice. They are automatically assuming that I am white. And that may mean that I get an interview because the person reviewing my resume is white. And these things, again, I mean, they're proven. It's not, these aren't things that people of color have made up to make white people feel guilty. I mean, these are things that have been studied, that have been documented, that research demonstrates. I mean, we were just talking, you know, a year or so ago, there was a big study that came out that you know, did show that resumes with names that sounded not white, you know, some more traditionally ethnic sounding names, were actually less considered, or less likely, you know, those candidates were less likely to be called for interviews and to move through the process of that job review. The name on the resume, when they tested for that and changed the name to a very white sounding name, like Joe Smith, for example, that same candidate got a call back. Yeah. So things like this are sort of what exemplify the definition of white privilege. And again, it's, you know, it's very layered and it's very complex, but at the end of the day, it just means that because I am racially white, I experience privilege in this world that I did not earn, but that I experience benefit, you know, because of my skin color.
You said a phrase, and I just keep writing these different phrases down because they're catching me, but you said presumed white regarding the resumes that come in. And I think that's kind of a huge thing. The presumption of any kind of an experience, and what you talked about at the beginning of this show, Jen, about being surprised at for me, being surprised at the level of animosity, at the level of outspoken racial discrimination and prejudice, and the numbers of groups coming forward and doing things, and things that I'm seeing because I'm looking and I'm paying attention to what's happening. And yet then, you know, Sam says, well, I'm not surprised. I hear this every day. And I think, wow, that presumed white, for me, I'm presuming things don't happen because in my white perspective, I don't see it. I don't hear it. But then when I do see it happening to others, then that's another layer, like you said, another layer of the white privilege of hearing it. This is not an easy conversation. So for those of you who are really watching this and wanting to have the conversation and look at it further, for those of you who are wondering what white privilege is and feeling like there's a finger of blame pointed at you, for those of you who are trying to figure out how to have conversations with other people or how to address situations when they happen, I want to encourage you to continue on with us into part 2 of this particular Spotlight on White Privilege series. We are going to, in this next show, in part 2 of this series, we're going to be really taking a deeper dive into what white privilege is, personal experiences, things that we don't think of that happen on a daily basis that are white privilege, that are examples within our culture, and you know, really begin that dialogue. And Jen, I'm going to rely heavily on you and your team to guide us through how can we have these kinds of non-accusatory but eye-opening and very honest communications around this issue with the intention, and I've said this before in both my Facebook Lives and in this show, the intention is the essence of the whole purpose of doing it. And the intention of this show is not to label or to blame, but it's to open up communication to help us grow toward a healing within our country and make those steps of progress with our, what did you say, cross-cultural interaction. So thank you to Jen Yeagley, with Executive Director of Community Tampa Bay, to Sam Obeid, Anytown Coordinator, Sarah Ogdie, Program Director with Community Tampa Bay, and for you, the audience, for joining in on this. We're doing this in a new format, being on Google Hangouts and then editing in different things for the show, but bear with us as we gain and lose strength of Wi-Fi, as we might hear a little bit of feedback. It's just technical, but it's an amazing technology that we have, that we're able to actually have this conversation and record it online and then be able to share it online too. So we're going to wrap up the show for now, but again, thank you three for being on, and we will see you for Spotlight on White Privilege Part 2.